A crash in the Alaskan wilderness brings unexpected visitors to my secluded world, but as survival turns to connection, two women force me to confront a choice I never thought I'd have to make: stay true to my solitude or risk my heart. For as long as I can remember, the wilderness has been my sanctuary. Life out here isn't for everyone, it's harsh, demanding, and lonely at times, but I've grown to appreciate its raw beauty in the peace it brings. My days follow a simple rhythm: chopping wood, fishing, and keeping an eye on the weather. The solitude might unsettle others, but for me, it's a reprieve from the chaos I left behind. Out here, nestled between the mountains and the sea, I've found a tranquility that I hadn't known in years. I moved to this remote corner of Alaska a couple of years back, seeking a fresh start. I keep mostly to myself, venturing into the small nearby town only when necessary. It's a tiny settlement, home to maybe 300 souls, with just a handful of buildings scattered along the shoreline. There's a couple of gas stations, a grocery store that also serves as a hardware shop, and a small flight service. I only head in for supplies, and with winter closing in, I couldn't put the trip off any longer. This morning, as I tied up my boat at the dock, I lost my footing and slipped into the frigid water. Before I could fully process the shock, Amber appeared to help steady the lines. Amber is around 19 or 20 and always seems to be on the dock when I come to town. While she's friendly and outgoing, I've always kept my distance. She's much younger than me, and out of respect for her family, I avoid anything that could be misinterpreted. It's clear she has a crush on me, but the age gap is too vast for me to entertain the thought. As she focused on securing the bow line, a reckless boater sped into the dock area, reversing hard to slow down. The sudden maneuver sent a massive wake rippling across the water. Amber, unaware of the wave coming, was knocked off balance and thrown into the icy water. Without a second thought, I dove in after her. The freezing cold hit me like a sledgehammer, nearly knocking the breath out of me, but I pushed forward, swimming toward her as fast as I could. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the boaters laughing at the scene, their amusement stoking my anger. But there was no time for confrontation. I had to get Amber out of the water. I reached her, gripping her tightly under her arms, and managed to drag her back toward the dock. Another person leaned down to help, pulling her up while I used the cleat to climb out myself. The water was bone-chilling, barely 38 degrees, and I could feel the cold sapping my strength. Amber and I were both shivering violently, our bodies trembling uncontrollably. We needed warmth, and fast. The best option was the shower on my cabin cruiser, just a short distance away. It had a full water tank and could provide the heat we desperately needed. I turned to Ben, an older dock worker who was already rushing toward us. "Ben, go find Lacey and let her know Amber fell into the water. She's on my boat, we'll be in the shower warming up. Amber's going to need dry clothes." "You got it, JW," Ben replied. Despite being in his 60s, Ben moved with surprising agility, sprinting down the dock. I made a mental note to thank him later. My focus turned back to Amber, who was curled up and shaking uncontrollably. I struggled to my feet, every muscle in my body trembling, and bent down to scoop her into my arms. My own strength was waning, but I couldn't afford to stop. Time was against us, and getting her warm was the only thing that mattered. I carried Amber onto my boat, my body trembling from the cold, and quickly started the generator. Rushing to the lower berth, I turned on the shower and helped her out of her soaked clothes. She was nearly limp, leaning heavily against the shower wall. Working quickly, I stripped down to my boxers and stepped in with her, guiding her under the warm stream of water. The tight shower stall left little room to maneuver, but I focused on rubbing her arms, back, and legs to stimulate her circulation. I silently thanked my past self for installing an on-demand water heater. It wasn't scalding, but it was warm enough to help stave off the bone-chilling cold. Amber had been in the icy water for 5 to 8 minutes, and I hadn't fared much better, but after about 10 minutes under the shower's steady stream, she began to recover. Feeling steadier myself, I decided to take a risk and stepped out to heat water on the stove. The warmth of a hot drink would do us both good. Still dripping wet and in nothing but my boxers, I fumbled with the matches, my shaking hands making it nearly impossible to light the burner. Frustration bubbled up, but just then, Lacey burst into the cabin, startling me. "Whoa, JW, you're barely dressed." "Where's Amber?" she asked, glancing around. "She's in the shower," I replied, my voice unsteady. "I'm trying to make some hot chocolate, but—" "Stop. Get back in the shower," Lacey said firmly. "I'll handle the drinks. Tom will be here soon." "What happened?" "Later," I mumbled, shivering. "Right now, I just need to warm up." Without another word, I returned to the shower. I didn't have the energy to care how it looked, standing in a tiny space with Amber, both of us trying to recover from the freezing water. Her back was still to me as I continued rubbing her arms and shoulders. "Your mom's here," I said softly, my voice hoarse. "Your dad's on the way. Just focus on warming up." Amber gave a faint laugh. "I think I'm okay now," she murmured. "This feels like a dream." Grateful she was improving, I finally stepped out and pulled on some dry jeans and a sweater. Lacey handed me a steaming cup of hot chocolate, the warmth radiating through the mug instantly soothing. "There's a little Irish twist in there," she said with a knowing smile. "Figured you both could use it." "Thanks, Lacey," I replied, taking a sip. "How's Amber?" "She's fine," Lacey said dryly. "She's just had her first shower with a man she seems to admire, and now she's seen most of you, apparently." I felt my face flush. It was the fastest way to warm us up. I didn't mean anything by it. Lacey waved me off with a grin. "Relax, JW. We understand. You do what you have to in situations like that. That water's brutal." Tom arrived soon after and nodded in agreement when he heard the story. "You handled it right. That wake was no joke. It must have been at least 4 feet high," he said, his expression darkening. "Probably that actress," Lacey chimed in. "She's been around here with her crew, scouting locations for some movie. From what I hear, she's a nightmare." After some more conversation, Tom, Lacey, and Amber prepared to leave. As Amber stepped off the boat, she turned to hug me tightly, her arms lingering around my waist. Before I could react, she leaned up and kissed me, her lips warm against mine. I managed to pull back quickly, glancing nervously at her parents. Amber spun away with a playful grin and walked off, leaving me flustered. I caught Tom and Lacey's knowing looks, but they didn't say a word. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, as their laughter faded into the distance. I've grown to appreciate the simplicity of life out here. A few years ago, my fiancé left me just months before our wedding. At the time, it felt like my world was crumbling, but looking back, I realize now that I probably dodged a bullet. Since then, I've decided relationships aren't something I need or want for the time being. The peace I've found in solitude has been enough for me. While at the store counter picking up supplies, I couldn't help but overhear a lively conversation nearby. "She's here to film some big movie set in Alaska," one of the men said. "Flying out of Ketchikan at the end of the week on her fancy jet." "JW, you should meet her," Jacob chimed in with a teasing grin. "She's a looker and about your age. Maybe she's searching for a real man." I shook my head and replied, "She's probably not the type to be tied down." My voice carried a hint of bitterness I didn't intend, but old wounds have a way of creeping up. "Don't blame all women for the one who left you," Emma said dryly, her sharp tone breaking through my thoughts. "You're not wrong," I admitted with a small smile. "I've made peace with it. She wasn't right for me." After a good-natured round of laughter at my expense, I settled my bill. "That'll be $374.58, Jacob announced as I handed over cash and gathered my supplies. The load was heavy, but with these provisions, I'd be well prepared for the coming winter. My instincts told me this one would be harsh, and over the years, I've learned to trust nature's subtle warnings. Before heading to my boat, I remembered I still needed to grab my mail, so I dashed back to the store. Inside, a small crowd had gathered, blocking the walkway. I politely squeezed past, only to hear an irritated voice call out, "You're a rude idiot." Without turning around, I replied over my shoulder, "Yeah, you have a nice day too," resisting the urge to say something sharper. As Emma entered behind me, I caught sight of the actress everyone had been buzzing about. Something about her demeanor reminded me too much of my ex-fiancée, spoiled, self-centered, and completely out of place in this rugged town. As I exited, I overheard her asking Jacob about me. I couldn't make out his response, but I was sure he'd smooth things over. He had a business to run, after all, and wasn't one to let petty misunderstandings linger. Her attitude rubbed me the wrong way, but I shrugged it off. My focus was on getting ready for winter. Over the next few days, I busied myself gathering driftwood from the beach and offshore, towing it back with my trusty D6 Caterpillar. I cut the wood into planks and firewood, enough to keep me warm through the long, cold months and to craft more picnic tables for sale in the spring. My shop has become something of a local attraction. It's decorated with the glass floats I find while beachcombing. Most of them are green, but occasionally I come across rare blues, yellows, or even reds. Folks admire the setup, but to me, it's just a way to add some color to an otherwise gray landscape. A few days later, I was up in the mountains gathering branches for my next chairmaking project. The work was physically demanding, but it was the kind of labor that kept me grounded. That's when disaster struck. I was forced back by the heat, a roaring fire spreading fast, consuming everything in its path. My heart raced as I realized there were people trapped ahead. Pushing forward through the smoke and flames, I managed to pull out several bodies one by one. Among them was the actress, though I didn't recognize her at first in the chaos. One of the men I dragged to safety had a particularly grim fate. He started coughing, a wet, rattling sound that sent a chill down my spine. Blood trickled from his mouth, ears, and nose as he weakly grabbed my shirt. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words carried a heavy weight. "Tell my wife." His sentence trailed off as he lost consciousness. I stared at him, stunned, knowing those words would haunt me. The chaos of the moment left little time to process the gravity of what had just unfolded, but deep down, I knew the impact would stay with me long after the fire was extinguished. "I'm sorry. I love her," the man whispered, his voice fading as he clung to his final moments. Then, just like that, he went still. He was gone. I sat there for a second, staring at him, my chest tight with the weight of what I had just witnessed. The chaos hadn't given me much time to process, but now, it hit hard. I moved quickly to check the others. Another man, likely one of the bodyguards, had already succumbed to his injuries before I even pulled him out. My hands trembled as I took stock of the situation. They weren't dressed for this kind of cold. Their thin jackets and city clothes were no match for the Alaskan wilderness. They probably thought they'd be back in Los Angeles by lunchtime. The actress, Lucy, stood nearby, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "Go sit with Paul and Janice," I told her firmly, though my voice softened as I added, "I'll make some calls and grab supplies. I'll be back in 15 minutes. Understand?" She nodded, dazed, and staggered over to where the other survivors were huddled. Watching them, it struck me how unprepared they all were, thrown into this life-or-death situation without a clue how to handle it. I didn't have much room to judge. I felt in over my head myself. I hurried back to the cabin and radioed the Coast Guard. The response came fast, but their words filled me with dread. "We can't fly out until at least the day after tomorrow," the voice crackled through the static. 75-knot winds and zero visibility. Our cutters are grounded. I swallowed hard. 2 more days of this. The conditions were already bad, and they'd only get worse. Returning to the wreck with blankets, pillows, and jackets, I parked my boat as close to Paul as possible to minimize movement in the biting cold. Paul was slumped against a makeshift shelter, his face pale and clammy. The women huddled nearby, their eyes wide with fear. Lucy's gaze met mine, heavy with desperation. I had to stay calm, for their sake as much as mine. Taking a deep breath, I knelt beside Paul and assessed his condition. Janice, surprisingly composed despite her injury, gave me the rundown: a weak pulse around 40, cold and clammy skin, swelling on his right side, and shallow, labored breaths. A head wound added to the grim picture. "He's in serious trouble," the doctor said over the radio. "But there's nothing we can do except wait for the weather to clear." Then the doctor shifted to Janice's arm. "It's a simple fracture, but it needs to be set now. The sooner, the better." I felt my throat tighten. "I'm not trained for this," I protested, my voice rising in panic. "I could make things worse." "The chief will guide you through it," the doctor assured me. "You've got this." The last thing I wanted was to play doctor, but Janice cut through my hesitation with a determined calm. "You have to do this," she said firmly. She took a swig of whiskey and held out her arm. "It's not as bad as it looks. Trust me, you can do it." Her unwavering confidence steadied my hands. Following the doctor's instructions, I set the fracture. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to stabilize her arm until real help arrived. The day wore on, the tension mounting as we waited for the storm to subside. At one point, Lucy, still shaken but no longer frozen in shock, stood and said, "What else can I do?" Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. I gave her a small task to keep her moving, gathering firewood or arranging blankets, but it was clear she was still processing the weight of the situation. Later, back at the cabin, Lucy finally sat down, though reluctantly. "Lie down," I said, grabbing the first aid kit. She scowled but obeyed, stretching out on the couch. "Hold still," I murmured as I carefully cleaned the gash on her forehead. She flinched at my touch, but I stayed as gentle as I could. "I'm not going to hurt you, but this needs to be cleaned and covered." "Fine," she muttered, though her body remained tense. The bandage wasn't my finest work, but it would hold. Once I finished, Lucy sat up, her eyes studying me with an intensity one wasn't expecting. "Thank you," she said after a pause, her tone softer now. "You're not as bad as I thought you'd be." "Well, I appreciate the glowing review," I replied, half smiling. She smirked. "I mean it. You really tried to help us." "Yeah, well," I said with a shrug, "it just means I can't mind my own business." "You're a real pain, you know that," she teased, her expression lightening for the first time since the crash. Despite everything, I couldn't help but laugh. Somehow, in the middle of the chaos, a moment of levity had found its way through. "I'm sorry, Janice," I said softly, trying to ease the tension. "It's been a long day. You need to rest. Help might come by morning." She shook her head, her expression firm but kind. "Help is already here," she said, "in the form of you." I gave a bitter chuckle, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm not much," I muttered, staring at the floor. Before Janice could respond, another voice cut in. "Talk about selling yourself short." I turned to see Lucy standing there, arms crossed and her usual skeptical look on full display. "She's supposed to rest," I said defensively. "And I'm not an idiot, despite what you seem to think," Lucy shot back, her voice sharp. "Yeah, well, you've got a chip on your shoulder about me," I retorted, the frustration rising. "Both of you, stop." Janice snapped, her irritation cutting through the tension. She looked at Lucy. "Go check on Paul. Leave JW to cook." Lucy rolled her eyes, turning toward the door. "I'm not hungry," she tossed over her shoulder. "Whatever he cooks would probably kill me anyway." That's not fair, Lucy, Janice said firmly, her tone motherly. You owe him an apology. Lucy glanced back, hesitated, then left without another word. Later, Lucy found me in my workshop, where I was sanding the edge of a table. She stepped inside, her demeanor different, calmer, more curious. Quite a setup you've got here, she said, her tone surprisingly friendly. It threw me off. It's how I make my living, I replied, keeping my voice professional, unsure of where this was heading. She gestured toward the table. You made this? I nodded. Yeah. Spruce and cedar, mostly from driftwood. Her brows raised in genuine surprise. Those ugly logs turn into something this beautiful? I smiled faintly, finding her reaction oddly satisfying. I cut, dry, and shape them. Tables, chairs, whatever I can think of. Her curiosity deepened. What else do you make? Cabinets, beds, shelves, I said, ticking them off. It depends on what I can salvage and what folks around here need. Lucy studied the table again, her earlier sharpness replaced by a quiet admiration. It's incredible, she murmured. The next morning, the Coast Guard still couldn't fly in. The storm hadn't let up enough. I followed the doctor's instructions for Paul, but I wished they could take everyone off my hands. Survival was one thing, having strangers depend on you in the middle of nowhere was another. Both Janice and Lucy had borrowed clothes from me by then. Janice wore an oversized shirt that dwarfed her petite frame, while Lucy's borrowed outfit fit her surprisingly well. She stayed close that day, quieter than usual, and her biting remarks seemed to have vanished. Strangely, her silence made me more nervous than her sarcasm ever had. Later, as I worked on securing some logs on the beach in the rain, I struggled with the cables, my hands slipping on the wet metal. Suddenly, another pair of hands appeared to help. It was Lucy. Together, we wrestled the logs into place, the storm raging around us. I didn't expect you to come, I said, surprised. She shrugged, her soaked hair clinging to her face. I couldn't just sit around. That night, as the storm finally began to ease, Janice and I talked quietly in the cabin while Lucy rested. When this camp is over, she'll move on, I said, keeping my voice low. She'll find someone more suited to her life back in Hollywood. You're underestimating her, Janice said, her tone serious. She's changing, JW. This isn't the Lucy you think you know. She's falling for you. Don't hurt her. I shook my head, feeling a pang of unease. Me? Hurt her? Once the Coast Guard gets here, this will just be a memory. Some adventure she'll romanticize until someone new comes along. Janice's gaze was steady. You're wrong. She won't forget you. I sighed, struggling to put my feelings into words. Janice, we haven't even kissed, let alone anything else. It's just summer camp syndrome. A crush born out of adrenaline. But as I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, her words lingered. What if it's not? By morning, the storm had finally broken. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, and the air was crisp and still. We shared breakfast, quiet but hopeful, and I began preparing Paul for transport. The Coast Guard was coming. The whir of the helicopter reached us half an hour later, growing louder as it approached. I stood outside, watching it descend, the rush of wind scattering loose leaves and rainwater. Relief washed over me, but so did something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I stepped outside as the helicopter landed, hoping the doctor would be on board. Sure enough, a doctor and a medic quickly exited and hurried into the cabin. Inside, they worked efficiently, hooking up IVs and stabilizing Paul for transport. Their practiced hands moved with precision, and I felt a wave of relief watching them take over. We'll be taking Paul and the young lady to Ketchikan, the doctor explained, gesturing toward Lucy. She needs a proper medical evaluation as well. Lucy glanced at me, her expression unreadable. Thank you, JW, she said quietly. I shifted uncomfortably, unused to this kind of attention. I'm no hero, I muttered, trying to brush off the gratitude. Well, you are to us, Lucy replied, her tone serious. Okay. You're welcome, I mumbled, feeling the weight of her words settle on my shoulders. Lucy let the moment pass, but the look in her eyes told me the conversation wasn't over, not yet. Later that day, the Coast Guard returned to pick up Janice and Lucy. I watched from a distance as they prepared to board, feeling an odd mix of relief and unease. Their presence had been making me nervous, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Just before stepping onto the helicopter, Lucy surprised me. She turned and hugged me tightly, catching me off guard. Then, before I could react, she leaned up and kissed me, quickly but firmly, on the lips. I froze, stunned, and by the time I found my voice, she was already climbing into the helicopter. The whir of the blades drowned out anything I might have said, and I stood there in silence as the aircraft rose into the sky, carrying them away. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it gets out here. The snow came hard and fast, and I threw myself into my work, crafting table sets to keep my hands and mind busy. But despite the quiet and my best efforts, two women lingered in my thoughts, Lucy and Amber. At Christmas, I got a surprise. A delivery man brought a package to my cabin, explaining it was from Amber. She'd asked him to drop it off if he was in the area. Inside were thoughtful gifts, a warm scarf, a book I'd once mentioned liking, and a note wishing me a Merry Christmas. It was simple, but it stirred something in me. I began to think about Amber differently. As the long winter dragged on, so did my thoughts. By the time spring arrived, the snow had melted, and the harsh season was finally behind me. I'd managed to finish 25 table sets, but my work hadn't kept my mind entirely occupied. One sunny afternoon, I stopped by the store for supplies. As I loaded my cart, Jacob and Emma were engaged in their usual banter. Jacob's been clamming up, Emma teased, wagging her finger at him. Then she turned to me, a knowing smile on her face. That actress has been asking about you, JW. She's really interested and wants to thank you for everything you did. I shrugged, uncomfortable under the spotlight. It was nothing. It wasn't nothing to her, Emma countered. Or to Paul and Janice, for that matter. Paul survived, you know, and he's been asking about you. They all have. Especially that actress, she's keen on you. I shook my head, trying to deflect. I just helped because I was there. That's all. She didn't have much of a choice. Emma gave me a knowing look. You're underestimating yourself. This Hollywood gal might be just what you need to move on. Yeah, right, I muttered, unconvinced. Why would someone like her be interested in me? I'm just a hermit. Emma's smile widened as she looked past me. You might want to rethink that, JW. I turned slowly to see Lucy standing a few feet away, her eyes sparkling with mischief. JW, she said, stepping closer, where's this flight service you mentioned? Her tone was casual, but the look she gave me was anything but. Before I could answer, Janice appeared, moving between us with a soft smile. I think Lucy's more interested in you than the flights, JW, she said lightly. Stop, Janice, I replied, shaking my head. My tone was firm, but my heart raced. Lucy just smiled, her expression as unpredictable as ever, and I realized I might not be as ready for this as I thought. All I was doing was pointing to the flight service, I said, trying to sound casual. Oh, really? Janice teased, her mood shifting into one of playful suspicion. Yes, really, I replied, my voice firmer. Janice raised an eyebrow. So, you weren't about to kiss Lucy? No, I stammered, caught off guard. I was just standing close. And your heads just happened to be inches apart, she pressed, her grin widening. Come on, JW. You know you were about to kiss her. Janice, stop, Lucy interjected, her voice calm but insistent. JW was just being nice. Janice still looked unconvinced. Nice? Sure, let's call it that. I cleared my throat, feeling increasingly awkward under their combined scrutiny. Lucy, however, stepped closer, her voice softening. You took care of us, JW, she said, her tone carrying a warmth that made my heart race. I was just in the right place at the right time, I insisted, trying to downplay it. And you helped, Lucy continued, her words quiet but resolute. Yeah, I helped, I muttered, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. And I owe you for that, she added, her eyes never leaving mine. No, you don't, I said, shaking my head. But as Lucy moved closer, her face now mere inches from mine, I could feel her warm breath, and for a brief moment, I didn't want that feeling to end. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Janice's voice cut through the moment. JW, you're not ready for how much Lucy has her sights set on you. Janice. Lucy's voice was sharp now, trembling on the verge of tears. I felt for her, caught in the center of all this attention. My own feelings made my pulse quicken, and I turned to Lucy, my voice steady despite my nerves. Look, I think I like you, more than a little. I'd like to get to know you better. But I'm just me. What you see is what you get. Lucy's cheeks flushed, and Emma and Jacob, standing nearby, beamed like they'd been rooting for this moment all along. It felt like everything was moving too fast, like it was all happening in the wrong place and at the wrong time. Backing away slightly, I tried to temper the moment. I'm not one to rush into things, I said, my voice quieter now, though the pounding of my heart was deafening in my ears. The next day, I was at the airstrip when their plane landed. Janice stepped out first, followed by Paul, who moved gingerly but smiled faintly at me. Then Lucy appeared, hesitating at the top of the steps. Her eyes scanned the small crowd nervously until they landed on me. The moment she spotted me, her face lit up, and she started walking toward me. As she got closer, she broke into a run, her arms flinging around me in a tight embrace. I barely had time to react before she kissed my cheek, and then, without warning, the kiss deepened into something far more passionate. A sharp throat clearing from nearby broke us apart. Joe, one of the flight crew, stood there, his expression a mix of amusement and mild discomfort. When should I pick you up tomorrow?" he asked Janice, clearly trying to redirect the moment. Janice replied with a knowing smile before turning back to us. Lucy was flustered, and I was barely keeping my composure. Janice, as usual, couldn't resist stirring the pot. "Mind if I kiss your boyfriend, too? You know, as a thank you?" Lucy whirled on her, her frustration plain. "He's not my boyfriend," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "I was just glad to see him, that's all." "Great," Janice said with a grin, "then you won't mind if I do this." Before Lucy could react, Janice leaned toward me with exaggerated flair. "Janice, stop," I said, taking a step back. Lucy, still flushed and clearly exasperated, muttered something under her breath that I couldn't make out. "Relax, Lucy," Janice teased, her mischievous smile still firmly in place. "You know I'm just kidding. But seriously, you two should figure this out. You're giving everyone whiplash." Lucy glared at her but didn't respond. I stayed quiet, unsure of what to say, but as I watched Lucy wrestle with her emotions, I couldn't help but wonder what would come next. This felt far from over. I decided to show them around the property, ending the tour at my favorite spot, the Point. It's a flat, clear area at the highest part of my land, offering a breathtaking view of the mountains and sea. Every time I stood there, it made me feel small in the best way, a reminder of how vast and beautiful the world can be. "Why didn't you build your cabin here?" Paul asked, clearly impressed. "The view is incredible. Building here would ruin it, I replied, glancing at the sturdy Sitka spruce nearby. I might add a bench under that tree someday, but nothing else. This spot is perfect for meditation. Meditation? Lucy looked surprised, almost amused. Yeah, I said with a shrug. When I can. This place calms me. Later, Amber arrived unexpectedly. She'd come alone, which caught me off guard. She was usually with her parents or friends when she stopped by. I was thinking we could have a salmon bake, I offered, curious about the sudden visit. That sounds good, Amber replied, though she hesitated. I don't want to intrude. You're not intruding, Lucy cut in, linking her arm with mine in an easy, almost territorial motion. Amber, right? I'm Lucy. This is Janice, and that's Paul. We're just visiting for a couple of days, JW invited us. Amber stayed polite, though I caught a spark in her eyes as she glanced at Lucy's hand on my arm. For the first time, I started rethinking my invitation, but it was too late. Amber insisted on staying. While I grilled the salmon out back, the women stayed inside talking. Paul joined me on the deck, watching the scene unfold from a distance. Looks like you've got your hands full, he said, smirking. Yeah, I admitted. I'm not sure what to do. Well, you've got 3 choices, Paul said, crossing his arms. Go after Lucy, pursue Amber, who's already hooked, by the way, or get on your boat and take off. I laughed dryly, but his assessment was spot on. All 3 options had crossed my mind. What would you do? I asked him. Paul looked thoughtful. If I weren't into Janice, I'd go for Lucy. She's changed a lot since last summer, and I think you've had something to do with that. But if I were you, I'd probably choose Amber. She's local, grounded, and knows what life here is like. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Paul made a good point, but my thoughts were tangled. Inside, the conversation between Amber and Lucy was heating up. I think you'd enjoy seeing the world, Lucy said, her tone light but probing. It could be good for you. You might even find better opportunities. Amber's gaze turned icy. I've seen the world, honey, and I know exactly what, and who, I want in it, she shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Lucy didn't back down. But a girl your age could learn so much at a university, she pressed. Why limit yourself? Amber's eyes flashed, and her expression tightened, but she didn't respond. After a moment, Lucy turned to me, her voice apologetic. I'm sorry, JW. I didn't mean to upset her, but I had to stand my ground. I glanced at Amber, who looked like she was ready to bolt. The tension in the room was thick, and it clicked. This wasn't about university or opportunities. It was about me. Lucy's career would always come first, and I would never be more than second place in her life. Amber, on the other hand, was willing to put me first. And in that moment, I realized something I'd been too blind to see. I loved Amber. Amber got up to leave, tears brimming in her eyes, and I followed her outside. Before she could go, I pulled her into my arms. Her tears began to fall, and her voice broke as she sobbed, I'm so sorry, JW. Amber, I said softly, brushing her hair back, you have nothing to apologize for. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I thought I'd ruined everything. You didn't ruin anything, I reassured her. In fact, you made me realize something I hadn't let myself admit. Amber's lips parted as if to speak, but she hesitated. I should probably go, she murmured. Do you want me to fly back with Lucy, Janice, and Paul? Her eyes flickered with fear and reluctance as she asked the question, and I knew her heart was in my hands. No, I said, my tone soft but serious. I want you to stay. Amber's brow furrowed in confusion. Why? She whispered. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Amber, do you know why Lucy is leaving today? She shook her head, her voice barely audible. No. It's because we both realized we wouldn't work out, I explained gently. Her eyes dropped to the ground, and I could see the uncertainty in her expression. I placed a hand under her chin, lifting her gaze back to mine. It's also because I realized I love someone else, I said, the words finally coming out. And that someone is you. Amber stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief, but slowly, a glimmer of hope began to shine in her tear-filled eyes.